So friends, welcome to our first C4 JEDI speaker series. My name is August Ball, and I am the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation. I want to take a moment to give you a little background about our organization. We are based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is on the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, Menominee, and Oneida people. And our mission is to help organizations develop practices and cultures that allow for them to authentically attract and retain a dynamic and diverse workforce. So in short, we hope to inspire people to live socially and environmentally just. I have had the pleasure of serving on numerous boards, alliances, task forces over the years, and we work with organizations all over the United States, including Toronto and South Africa. We are a social enterprise and also Wisconsin's first Black-owned certified B Corp. So again, we work with organizations all across the United States and in surrounding countries, helping them develop the practices necessary to be an organization that is inclusive of the diversity that our world has to offer. And in turn, we use the proceeds from this work to provide paid training and employment opportunities to young adults of color, predominantly right here in Milwaukee. And we call this the social impact version of leg of our model. So we work on land, and we do this in partnership with local parks departments, the DNR, land trusts, and we train young people in conservation skills like invasive species identification and remediation, trail building, forestry, and the like. We also work in the space of water by helping young people get introduced to careers in water reclamation, educating them about climate science, and these young people get prepared for careers that would allow them to work in wastewater treatment facilities, installing and maintaining green infrastructure, etc. We also work in the space of food sovereignty, and we do this in partnership with the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, the Boys and Girls Clubs, as well as our local parks department. These young adults learn how to grow food from seed, and they also learn about soil science and entrepreneurship, and they get to sell their produce either to local restaurants and or donate them to local charities that address food insecurity. Lastly, we work in the space of policy as well, educating young climate activists on the realities of climate change, as well as how they can get civically engaged, regardless of if they are eligible to vote yet or not. So that's enough about Cream City Conservation. I'd like to introduce now our speaker for this first speaker series, which is Dr. Cassandra Jean. And Dr. Cassandra Jean, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, August. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully it works well this time. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are today. I'd like to, thank you all for making this space to come in to listen to my talk today. So today I'll be speaking on using an intersectional climate justice approach when it comes to examining the experiences of marginalized groups. And so I first want to acknowledge the fact that because I'm at the University of Washington, I want to acknowledge the past, present, and future people of the coastal Salish tribes of this land whose traditional lands we study, work, and gather on. So I do want to give this space to them. So as August said, my name is Cassandra Jean. I am a public sociologist. I graduated from the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard University in May 2021. And so right now, my research serves on the axis of equity, collaboration, justice, truth, and service. And so my research interests largely focus on chronic and acute stressors of environmental or disaster-related hazards and its impact on historically marginalized groups. And so to do this, I use a mixed methods approach, meaning that I employ both qualitative and quantitative work, as I feel like it provides a more holistic viewpoint of what's going on. And so my research goals overall are twofold. The first is interrogating local and federal barriers that may prevent one's access to equitable services or programming. And then the second is to diversify the environmental disaster field. And so to start off, I want to, talk about what's going on right now. As we know, a lot of disaster scholarship environmentalists have been calling for change when it comes to climate change, as we're seeing that there's a threat increasing. And so there needs to be a more inclusive and equitable way of going about thinking about, maintaining our livelihoods, making sure that we're able to adapt to the changing climate, as we've seen with the heat waves happening, the floods that are occurring. And so one way that I do this is by amplifying the scholarship of historically marginalized individuals. So that includes the BIPOC community, LGBTQIA, women, and so on and so forth, those that are disabled, those who may have housing precarity, any of the sort that are historically marginalized. And so to do this, I incorporate a global interdisciplinary approach to broaden perspectives and then find different ways to integrate these various forms of methodologies and analyses so that we can come up with a more holistic and equitable way of going about doing this work. And so one thing that I want to introduce to you all is the intersectional climate justice framework. So this framework was actually conceptualized with a planning lens. And so the framework, to build it, they took a narrative and analytical review of methodologies to provide a state-of-the-art overview of the main debates in the field, mainly disaster and environmental, and then try to figure out ways to move the field forward and then inform it with a conceptual framework. So this framework here, I have an image here, and I'll be sure to send a link to this article after the talk. But there's 5 components to the intersectional climate justice framework. The first tackles gender and race inequalities, redresses drivers of differential vulnerabilities, develops ethics and politics of care, adopts place-based and placemaking approaches, and then operationalize climate action and community resilience. And so before dissecting going into the different facets of the framework, I'd like to first take a step back and talk about what intersectionality is. So I'm sure we've all heard this term floating around. It's been in, the political sphere. We've seen it become very publicized, but I want to take a step back and to understand what intersectionality is, or its foundation. And so it was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw when she was at a court case, and she realized that a Black woman was not only marginalized because of her race, but also of her gender. And so she realized that the court system, or legislator, has not caught up to understanding how these two different facets intertwine with each other, and then how individuals that hold certain identities may be oppressed. And so I'm using Pat Hill Collins' interpretation of intersectionality, which is a facet of Black feminist thought, in which it contends that multiple micro-level intersecting categories, so that means race, gender, age, are concurrently or simultaneously affected by larger systems. So that means the healthcare system, education, media, FEMA, and so on. And so looking at this wheel, which I thought was absolutely perfect because it provides us with a visual of what intersectionality would look at, it encompasses 3 components: power, oppression, and privilege. So in the middle where we see there's power, those identities that are here are those that usually, as we've seen, or historically have owned some kind of power and has, I don't want to say unintentionally, but unintentionally impacted other people, or it may impact the way that individuals have their own personal lived experiences. And so the further away we get from this circle, we see that identities that have been historically marginalized. So when we look at some social categories such as language, non-English or monolingual Individuals are oftentimes left out when it comes to understanding disaster responses, as it may be put into English. Sometimes it's not even put in plain English, right? Very scientific language. When we talk about income, where we have the rich were able to have economic barriers to protect themselves from any type of environmental disaster related hazard, versus low to moderate income households, or those that do not have an income at all, which may be left out. We also have those that are owned property, where we see like a lot of legislative or like insurance may protect those who own property versus those who are renting or may have some kind of housing precarity or are experiencing homelessness altogether. And so on and so forth, right? So we have citizenship here, skin color, formal education. So what we see as westernized formal education, going to school, whether that is getting an actual degree versus those who may have traditional knowledge, right? That learned from their lived experiences. Sometimes those forms of knowledges have not been validated, right? So when we're thinking of intersectionality and the power wheel of privilege, I want us to keep this wheel in mind and to understand how we can think about making equitable choices, right? And who we should include in our space when we're thinking about making a more equitable and just programming when it comes to environmental or disaster related hazards. And so with the first component of the intersectional climate justice framework is its need to tackle underlying systemic reinforcers of racial and gender inequalities. So going back to the tenets of intersectionality. And so research has shown that these groups, racial and gender or gender groups that experience these different forms of oppression and discrimination are more vulnerable or placed in more vulnerable positions to experience climate change because they're less likely to own land and resources, depending on where they are, right? May have less education or training, or less access to institutional support, health services, information, or just have fewer opportunities to participate in the decision-making process, right? So when we're thinking about who's in the room making the decisions for us, right? If we take a look at our current administration, who's in this House and the Senate, now it's looking a little bit more diverse, but previously there was a lot of missing identities in that space. And because of that, a lot of people have been left out in the decision-making process, but have to adhere to laws and policies and programming because it's federally mandated, right? And so understanding the different drivers of injustices when it comes to racial or gendered capitalism or race-blind climate policies, right? So removing the fact that, for example, President Trump removed from the House of Urban and Development, HUD, removed from the website protections for LGBTQIA individuals, right? So that may be based off of gender or sexual identity, and removing that language also removes a protective factor that they received from it, right? And if we're thinking about how HUD may feed money into FEMA, they're now, unable to find their resources when it comes to finding housing or shelter after disaster. And so some pathways to acknowledging these things are to recognizing and questioning economic reinforcers of racial and gender inequalities. When we think about COVID, Black women were more likely to end up in unemployment or to have low income or to actually see a reduction in their income, right? And so we need to figure out why. Basically, why? And so to do this, we need to dismantle different forms of oppression by devising equity goals and key regulations, plans, and programmings, and then overall including these people, right? So when we're looking around in our room or in our research group, and we need to figure out who's not here, consider the racial and gender dynamic of who's not in the room, who needs to be there, and whose voices should be included. The second component addresses drivers of differential vulnerabilities. So one of my favorite quotes by Frantz Fanon, who was a philosopher in the 1960s, he said, if you want to know what's wrong with society, you need to ask the ones that are oppressed, overshadowed, those who have not experienced any benefits from society, right? So we need to understand the drivers of these different injustices, understand the historical and structural inequities that may come about from these historical injustices. So right now, I don't know if you all have caught up to this, but in Houston, they're looking at whether the Black community and Latinx community in that area, the Black community and Latinx community in that area have been exposed to toxins, right? As we're seeing different factories being laid next to their houses, and then figuring out who's getting the money when it comes to recovery, right? After Hurricane Harvey, on top of the fact that they're living next to factories, which has been historically placed in low to moderate income households and BIPOC communities, now you add this hurricane on top of that. And so now all of their households and their livelihoods have been completely destroyed, yet they're not the ones that's receiving most of the funds. It was usually middle to high income houses in Houston that received the money. Well, why is that? We need to consider historical legacies of injustices, include the people that are placed in the most vulnerable positions within the decision-making process. That's how we go about addressing these differential vulnerabilities. Be candid about what's going on, acknowledge the history, right? And by acknowledging the history and acknowledging the experiences that individuals are going through, now you're able to create a more holistic picture of how do you go about answering these questions, right? A lot of times we're asking questions and assuming like maybe these things will help. Well, one thing to do is to ask, did you ask if these things will help? Like, did you ask your target population, your target audience, would these things help? And one way to do that is by including these things and then acknowledging how historically these individuals have been impacted by past decisions. The third component focuses on taking politics and ethics of care seriously. So the driver of the injustice here is where cities are centered on production over reproductive work. So if we're thinking about different areas that have been dealing with the heat wave, right? We know that in heat islands or in the city where there isn't a lot of acreage or trees or parks or any type of green spaces, these individuals are experiencing the heat wave at a much disproportionate rate as to other people who may have shaded areas or cooling centers to go to. One example of this, I did a project when I was in Howard, collaborating with the National Park Service. And so we went around and we asked individuals who are experiencing homelessness or involved in some kind of substance, what they felt about their sense of place with the park that they frequented, right? And so in Washington, D.C., in a huge city, there's only about so many parks. And this park in particular that we went to one in Southeast, which is a historically low to moderate income area, and then one in Northwest, which is kind of like middle to high income areas. And we spoke about what does this space mean to you? And so I found that the individuals who are experiencing homelessness or, having substance abuse or just whatever life experiences that they had, they found that park space to be a space of communion and they made sure to keep it clean despite it being in a low income heavy police area. So they had a certain care for their space because of the fact that this was their space to congregate for safety. And then in turn, that green space took care of them, right? So they had somewhere to go in the daytime and they took care of this space. So they weren't as policed, even though we know historically low to moderate income areas are oftentimes policed heavily. And so they cared for the place and had a sense of pride for it, even though they referred to the spot as Jurassic Park, right? So hearing something like that, why is it that we're hearing these kinds of things? Them calling their place of comfort Jurassic Park. Well, that's when we go back to component 2, where we're understanding the historical influences or injustices that may have happened to make them conceptualize their space in this way, right? And so having the city come in and to actually take care of this space would help more versus in Northwest where individuals didn't have that same sense of attachment or relationship with the land, but they went there because it was next to their house, because it was pretty. They could have picnics there, do their brunch and drink alcohol, like their, champagne and everything, even though that's technically illegal on federal lands, but they were able to do this, right? So the way that they took care of their place didn't mirror how the people in Southeast took care of their place. Yet the place in Northwest was more upkept. There was more care put to it. And so one way to acknowledge all of these injustices as far as how people's spaces are being taken care of, if they have those green spaces, is again, acknowledging the historical legacies of the injustices, recognizing valued unpaid care where, in Southeast, the individuals were cleaning up the parks. They didn't have park people coming in to clean up the parks, but in Northwest, they did have park people coming in to clean in the parks, mainly because it was higher income individuals coming there to see it. And so we need to rethink the green spaces and just different areas from a care perspective, putting care relation and self-care at the forefront. How can we take care of these green spaces and those that take care of these green spaces? And in turn, how can these green spaces take care of us? The fourth component talks about adopting a place-based and place-making approaches. So the driver of injustice in this component speaks about colonial, scientific, and technocratic and experiment-driven approaches to planning and development. So this is when I spoke about having to validate traditional ecological knowledge versus formal knowledge, right? So intersectionality considers all forms of knowledge and the structural dimensions which shape those experiences and knowledge forms. And so it acknowledges the role played by place and space in shaping people's perceptions and experiences of privilege, discrimination, and oppression. And so we're looking at the police state, how landscapes have been disciplined and practiced, and how they've been treated. So an example of this, the indigenous tribes in the Pacific Northwest that were forced over on this area and then forced off of their land, they still have a connection to nature, right? So they take care of, or they understand how the water is important to their culture. They have a very special relationship with the shellfish here. Yet with the heat wave that happened in 2021 and 2022, a lot of the shellfish died, right? And if they didn't die, they now had a whole bunch of diseases where if the fish were consumed or the shellfish were consumed, it may cause some kind of food poisoning, right? But you have to understand, telling people who found some kind of connection with the shellfish not to eat the food, that's not gonna fly, right? These are something that's cultural and spiritually connected to them. And so we need to understand how this placemaking, how their relationship with the land and with the animals there, with nature, with one another, how do all of these cultural impacts influence our decision-making, influence how we're able to adjust with the changing climate or different environmental hazards that happens, and how do we maintain our livelihoods, right? To make sure that historically marginalized groups like Indigenous folks are protected, not only from climate change, but the different factors of climate change or the different factors that may come about from environmental hazards, like being next to Superfund sites, like having the fact that they don't have access to adequate healthcare, or the fact that they may be low to moderate income. These are also coastal communities, right? So if we're thinking about the fact that the Pacific Northwest is due for a huge earthquake, and with the earthquake comes a huge tsunami. These are the first individuals that's going to be impacted by this. And so we need to understand their relationship to the land, because we've already, US law has already pushed them over to this area, and now telling them that they may have to move when they've already had a connection here. These are some things that need to be recognized, right? And in order to understand these different facets or these different cultural impacts is to recognize the traditional situation, local knowledge arising from the diverse and often invisible experiences of place and space, right? What do these areas mean to these people? How does it impact them? How do they impact it? How does that relationship happen? And how can we come up with a more equitable way of understanding how to go about navigating this land, right? A lot of Indigenous folks are people that historically have just have a relationship with the land. They understand the dynamics of the land. They're able to trace things by nature, right? Whether there's certain birds that may come about during a certain time, and they understand, okay, this is what's happening here, or maybe different weather changes that they're able to know before maybe like the National Weather Service is able to tell us that there's a weather change, right? Having these different forms of knowledge can be very, very impactful. And so it's important to incorporate these things and to understand how different structural injustices has impacted them to adjust to their situation. And now having this attachment to their place, attachment to their land, that's very important. And so that should always be considered. The last component of this is to promote a cross-identity climate action community resilience building, right? So incorporating all kinds of social justice movements into understanding the environmental and climate hazards or situations that we're about to face, right? Climate justice is social justice. Environmental justice is social justice. All of these things are all connected, and intersectionality tells us that individuals that are historically marginalized or hold historically marginalized identities or spaces, if we're thinking about housing characteristics, where our location is, whether we're able to live in the city, if we're able to live in the rural area, wherever the case may be, how does all of these things impact our level of engagement when it comes to addressing our issues, right? So what we see is that there's limited citizen involvement, engagement, and adaptation planning, implementation, and evaluation. And this is oftentimes because, one, their experiences are not validated. Two, the way in which other individuals without Westernized knowledge, or that do not adhere to Westernized forms of knowledge, those aren't validated, or they're not even invited in the room to speak or to make decisions or to vote on how different policies and programs may impact them, right? And so there's this limited and tokenistic civil society participation where, yes, we are afforded a vote when it comes to federal offices and local government offices and things of that nature. But what about individuals that have been previously incarcerated, sometimes unjustly, right? Their civic engagement is now removed from them, and they also do not have access to a lot of federal benefits, which is something that they need in order to reintegrate into society, right? Those that were previously incarcerated right now in Houston, or in Texas, or in different parts. In Texas, they're dealing with the heat wave and they don't have air conditioning, right? So they have an experience that other people don't have. During the snowstorm in New York in Rikers Island, there was a blackout at the prison, and they're also dealing with this cold weather, right? And so when they reintegrate back into society, how are their voices being integrated into the planning? How are individuals that are experiencing homelessness or housing precarity dealing with this? How are individuals with disabilities that aren't able-bodied, or may have any type of mental or educational impairment? How are their voices being incorporated? How is the queer community, LGBTQIA community, being incorporated into this? Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, how are their voices being introduced? Even children, right? We're seeing how Gen Z is now coming in, and they're coming in as a big force, and they're speaking on their experiences. And because of their age, a lot of times it may be overshadowed, even though they have the wherewithal to understand what's happening to them and understand that there are these things that are going to impact them in their future. And so they need to be empowered. They need to have the space to speak on themselves and not have people speak for them. And by empowering local communities, you're able to not only lead the change, but also increase the community resilience, right? So when you give people the power to fend for themselves, or give them the resources in order to do the things that other people are able to do more easily, you'll see a more equitable change. You'll see more adaptation when you acknowledge the different historical injustices that impact them, the current injustices that impact them, how their identities and conditions may impact their decision-making, but also how can we go about making sure that these individuals are empowered enough to teach their other community members who may not have an education and may not know how to read or write, or do not speak English, right? So there's different facets that we need to consider, because not all communities are homogenous. And so investing in mentoring programs, supporting participation, training, and representation of grassroots organizations, nonprofits, individuals that have direct connections to the community, and also the different social movements that may come about it. Not only just having your performative statement, yes, we care about these individuals, but actually putting action behind all of these statements that organizations tend to put out. These things are very, very important when it comes to understanding how historically marginalized and vulnerable populations are able to navigate or even move through these spaces. And so that's the 5 components that are found within the intersectional climate justice framework. I want to shift over to how I use intersectionality in my research. And so for my research, I focused on the 2017 hurricane season. And so for those that don't remember, in 2017, hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, Nate came, but it wasn't as strong of a hurricane as the other 3. But these 3 hurricanes came within about 2 months of each other. So Hurricane Harvey came in like early September, and then Maria, the last one, coming in around late September, October. And so looking at this storm, I noticed that a lot of people were speaking about what was happening in the Houston area, how Irma was impacting Florida, and then also Puerto Rico. But a lot of the times I didn't hear how the US Virgin Islands was being impacted. And so I know you can't see it on this map, but Puerto Rico's right here. The US Virgin Islands is about 43 miles next to Puerto Rico and about 1,000 miles from the actual contiguous United States. And so with this project, I use intersectionality not only as a critical social theory, but also as a knowledge project. And so Collins, Pat Hill Collins says that a knowledge project serves as an analytical and philosophical understanding of actual material conditions, so the lived experiences of oppressed people, and it's concentrated on resistance to some intangible social change while challenging systemic oppressions. So an example of a knowledge project in the Black community is how hip hop, rap, and the blues have been used to show the different housing, police injustices, economic injustices that were going on within the Black community. It is something that was actually spread nationwide, worldwide, where now individuals were able to listen, right, to these words and listen to these stories, these different forms of storytelling, and were able to get some kind of idea of what was happening with the Black community. Another example in in a disaster context, Hurricane Katrina. Unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina exposed a lot of weaknesses and faults when it came to disaster and environmental responses, to the point where now we're still learning from Katrina, right? And Katrina happened a long time, not even a long time ago, but it happened a long time ago. But the images that came out from Hurricane Katrina, for thinking about people standing on top of their cars, on top of their roofs, and they're waving, asking for help, right? When the levees broke. So that's when the disaster actually happened, after the fall, after all of the rainfall, and the levees broke, which caused another disaster where you had all these very aggressive flooding. This is what drowned and killed and displaced a lot of individuals. And so this is a way that we should understand what's happening. And so with my research, overall, I just wanted to know, how did Black women from the U.S. Virgin Islands experience the 2017 hurricane season? And so a little bit of background about the Virgin Islands. Here you have a clear picture of how close Puerto Rico is to the Virgin Islands. In 2017, about 76% of the residents there identified as Black, around 16% identified as white, and about 17.4% identified as Latino or Hispanic. About 28% of the population lived under the poverty line, with a median income of around $37,000. And nearly half of those households were female headed. And so a lot of the income that comes into the Virgin Islands is fueled by tourism, right? So when people come over for vacation, and they have a huge tourist economy there. And so the three larger islands of the U.S. Virgin Islands are St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. And so going over the literature, I wanted to see what was already out there, right? And so a lot of times when we're looking at vulnerable populations or populations that's placed into vulnerable situations, we think about how they're marginalized economically, right? So how low to moderate income individuals are able to respond to different disasters. Socially, whether individuals have voting rights. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, even though they are U.S. territory, they do not get to have a vote when it comes to congressional issues or even voting for U.S. president. A lot of times their votes go towards their local government, but they do have representation, right? But the fact that they have representation, but no voting rights, that stratifies them, or that removes some kind of power that other states are able to have. Also, Puerto Rico has the same issue where they are a territory, but are not able to vote for president. So that's the political marginalization that they may deal with. And because of this, they're not able to ask for or even advocate efficiently for the necessary funds that they need to protect themselves from the disasters. As we've seen in the pictures before, the U.S. Virgin Islands experienced both Hurricane Irma and Maria within a 2-week span. And I don't know if you all remember, but there was a storm that was supposed to happen in between Irma and Maria, right? Where all the other places that did get hit, Puerto Rico dealt with Hurricane Maria, which was a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane. It sat on Puerto Rico for a long time, which caused a lot of damage. So that's where most of their damage came from. But the Virgin Islands had to deal with both Irma, a Cat 4, and Maria, Cat 5, within 2 weeks of each other, without having the economic wherewithal to even pick up, right? And they didn't even have the time to adjust or to breathe, because because of the threat of incoming disasters. And they're no stranger to these different types of environmental or disaster-related hazards. They also have to face flash flooding, earthquakes. There's tornadoes that are found within the hurricanes that they have to deal with. So all of these things are impacting them. And because we've seen how there's high levels of poverty, and a lot of times it's the impoverished areas are also female headed. Now we're thinking of the fact that these individuals may have children with them, right? So having to take care of their children with low income in an area that has been damaged by storms, how does this impact the way that they're able to recover and respond from their situation? And so scholars have found that usually low income households have a prolonged recovery time. Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, they also have a more prolonged recovery time. When it comes to LGBTQIA communities, sometimes they're kind of shut out of even getting shelter because people may not recognize their union. People are still, hold on to their values. And some people value the fact that a union is between a man and a woman and that it doesn't deviate from that. Well, that leaves out a very huge population of people who now have to navigate not only dealing with discrimination from the shelters, but now how do we take care of our family? And if they have anyone who may be disabled, or if they may have children or elderly in the household, how are we going to take care of those individuals, right? And so because of that, they're not able to respond in the same way where cisgendered white men, rich white men are able to respond with their families, right? If we're thinking about during the COVID-19 pandemic, how were different families able to adjust? Right? A lot of Black and brown households lost a lot of family members. And so now they have to deal with grieving and adjusting to this pandemic and trying to navigate going to school, going back to work, not having a job, or now their skills may not be as celebrated as it was once upon a time. And so some identified gaps is the fact that we're looking at these different identities as silos, but individuals don't live in silos, right? Individuals live, our lives are very complex. And so we should understand and acknowledge each of these facets because all of these plays a role in the way in which we're able to respond and recover from a disaster. And so that's, some of the main things that I found. And so I wanted to highlight this quote here from Ronnie Dean Buren, who was a survivor of Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And she said, because of the intersection at which we live as Black women, things are less accessible for us and we can often be ignored, right? So this is coming from an individual who understands the fact that there are some discrepancies in the way which society responds to us. And because of that, we're often ignored when it comes to planning, when it comes to recovery efforts, when it comes to even trying to figure out how do we mitigate these things or building community resilience. A lot of times these voices are excluded and then because of that overshadowed and ignored. And the fact that this is a sentiment that's shared from this was an interview in a local newspaper. This is a sentiment that's been exclaimed, right? And this is not a new sentiment at that. So that means that in 2022, we need to make more intentional changes or more intentional actions when it comes to making sure that individuals do not feel this way. And so the methodology with my work, I went to St. Thomas, which is the larger of the three islands. It kind of gets more of the traffic when it comes to tourism. I went in 2019, June of 2019, so 2 years after the storm. I conducted focus groups with two groups that had about 10 women each. And the focus groups lasted for about 70 to 90 minutes. So the focus groups were set up during their the individual's yearly office training seminar. Funny enough, they were doing disaster training at the same time. So I was just like, it fits in. So the occupations of the women that were involved in this ranged from interns to administrative assistants. We had a gynecologist in the room, a couple of home health care aides, licensed practical nurses. We had someone who was a director of medicine, some primary care physicians, and different nursing aides on different levels. And so I wanted to show some pictures of when I went to the Virgin Islands, to St. Thomas, and I was talking to my cab driver. And so he was saying this church here on the left-hand side, the Calvary Baptist Church, this used to be a huge space for just to congregate, right, and to fellowship. And as you can see, or it may not be as clearly, but hasn't been inhabited because there's no roof. The roof was completely shattered and removed from the building. And so because the church area was not of high concern, because individuals had to worry about their own homes and their livelihoods and their jobs, this building is still left standing. So that now we're thinking about the different mold and hazards that may come from that may breed health issues, right? When we look over here, we see houses in the local neighborhoods that don't even have doors yet, right? Or they still have blue tarps over their roofs. Just areas that are still in the process of recovering from the storm. And this is 2 years after the fact. I want to keep on reiterating that, because I don't think that we can conceptualize this happening in like a rich area of Houston, because a lot of times after disasters, some wealthy households or like moderate to high income households even see a jump in credit score, right? Or they become even richer, quote unquote, after the storm. But now we're seeing an area, a beautiful island with a very, very rich culture, strong people having to fend for themselves because they're not acknowledged in the same way that other areas are acknowledged. We have here the local gas station. You can see like this building right next to it where it's like this very thin tin-like a structure to build the houses. And a lot of the buildings have this very tin-like infrastructure. And so this is not strong enough to protect them when the disasters occur. And so due to the lack of media coverage that they received, where there was a large focus on the mainland and Puerto Rico, a lot of times these people felt overshadowed. During that time, plane tickets skyrocketed in 2017. So I had a friend whose mom was on the island and she couldn't go visit or even bring her over because tickets went from costing $200 to $300 to go round trip from DC to the Virgin Islands to almost $1,000 round trip, right? So now we're talking about access to evacuation that cannot happen with a country that is low to moderate income. And you have this jump after 2 storms. How is that possible? Or how do you expect people to deal with that? And so some themes that arrived from my study. The first one dealt with traumatic experiences. So the women spoke about the overwhelming roles that they had to take on. So not only as individuals themselves, but as mothers, as girlfriends, as daughters, as healthcare professionals, as emergency managers, as first responders, right, as caretakers for the neighborhood. They spoke about the fact that a lot of things felt unequal everything, right? The fact that news coverage was unequal. I don't know if you all remember during that time, after Hurricane Maria, former President Trump went to Puerto Rico and was throwing paper towels at the individuals, right? So that just the way in which people are being received, how victims are being received, is very telling, right? And the fact that they didn't even get a visit on top of that, right? So not only are, the Puerto Ricans being disrespected in that way, the people in the U.S. Virgin Islands weren't even acknowledged for their experiences. In fact, former President Trump said, if they have an issue, they can call their president. He was the president, right? So that just shows his lack of acknowledgement of who these individuals are. And so because of this, it led to a lot of extreme psychological stresses where now a lot of the women had PTSD symptoms, but didn't recognize them as being PTSD. A lot of the times the individuals also reference, or the older individuals reference Hurricanes Marilyn and Hugo, right? So talking about previous experiences and how they had to navigate that space and how destructive those hurricanes were, and the fact that this 2017 hurricane season reminded them of these past hurricanes, and they're still dealing or healing from these past hurricanes, which happened in 1989 and in 1995. And with climate change now still increasing in the threat of the disasters that come from it, or the hazards that come from it, we're going to see more compounded stressors if we don't go ahead and address this. So one individual, I asked them, like, did you feel like this was the worst hurricane season? And she said, we had Hugo and we had Marilyn, we lost our homes and stuff, but because this came back to back, we couldn't have time to breathe. So yes, I would see this as the worst. So the fact that this was Irma and Maria happened within 2 weeks of each other. So they were left in the dark completely by Irma, and whatever Irma didn't take, Maria literally wiped away. That's what they had to deal with. And the fact that that wasn't acknowledged is very, very detrimental to them. The second theme were the unmet needs and struggles that they had to deal with. So going back to the dissatisfaction of local and federal government when it came to media coverage, a lot of the times the women brought up the fact that the Weather Channel, even though they learned how to read the Weather Channel because they realized that a lot of times people don't acknowledge that these storms are going to hit the Virgin Islands. So they took the time to learn how to read it, but they'll go, oh, here's this storm. It's passing over the Virgin Islands. It's going to hit Puerto Rico, but it's actually hitting Florida. And so we should focus on what to do with the individuals of Florida. Not saying that people in Florida do not deserve media coverage, but the people in the U.S. Virgin Islands deserve equal amounts of media coverage or equal amount of recognition from the federal government as these other places. There shouldn't be a fight on who deserves whatever the case is, but there needs to be equitable coverage, equitable acknowledgement so that everyone's needs are met in an equitable fashion. They spoke about the lack of resources that they had because this is a low to moderate income country. A lot of times water to tarps, food and gas ran out quickly. And because there was only one or two ways out of the island, by water, by air, most of the resources were being given to Puerto Rico after Maria. And so they had a lack of meals to eat, right? So now they had to ration, they had to figure out what to do when it came to gas to keep their housing cool. Because again, this happened during the summertime, peak summertime where it's hot, right? We're thinking about individuals that have to take medicine that needs to be refrigerated, you know, those takes up gas. And when gas is already scarce during this time, what does that mean for individuals with health issues, right? What does it mean for individuals who do not have the ability to walk around? There's a lot of pregnant women there, right? And so they weren't able to help when it came to recovery, but they also needed these basic necessities that were nowhere to be found or were very limited. They highlighted the poor and antiquated infrastructure. I showed you all a picture of what the housing looked like, right? And so they called for modernization of their neighborhoods, of their households. They also highlighted insignificant finances and preparation. The fact that some people, one girl, she was saying how she was a high school student at the time, and she didn't understand the different dynamics when it came to insurance, right? So a lot of the times individuals would say that the insurance companies promise one thing, but then they don't fulfill their promises. And this is a very controversial because of the fact that they're already a low to moderate income household or country, and that they may not have the same amount of finances to prepare them or to mitigate any type of disasters within their own households when these environmental disaster hazards occur. And so one quote from this, which I thought was really powerful, the fact that we're in American territory, we're treated like a third world country if and when they remember us. This is frustrating. And then you have people that come in yesterday and they want to know, why are you guys still living under tarps? Why do you still have this? Why do you still have that? And she said, because not everyone has the means to do what needs to be done. A lot of the insurance companies were not what they said they were, so you didn't get what you promised. And there's little help in helping to get justice for the people that were treated so criminally, for a lack of better word. So the fact that this woman highlighted the word criminally, right? The fact that her existence or the existence of the people on this island were treated as less than, as criminal, as a third world country, where if we're thinking about how the world understands a third world country, it's usually not in a positive light, right? So the fact that she's saying this is how you view us, even though we are in American territory, we by law are Americans, but we're not acknowledged as such. The third deals with the survival of the vulnerable. So a lot of times they spoke about fear that they had for low to no income individuals, elderly, children, those that had any type of disability or they were dealing with housing precarity, the different lasting property damages that they had, and the fact that they did not have enough to survive with. So the fact that whatever they had, they would share with their neighbors because they knew their neighbors may have lost all of their all of their resources in the storms, right? If we're thinking about how the hurricanes came, knocked over their roofs, destroyed their entire households, all of these things, how did that impact the way in which they were able to survive after the fact when they didn't have anything left? And so one woman highlighted something which I thought was really, really powerful and almost kind of like disheartening. Well, not almost, it was disheartening. She said, "We didn't have a fully functioning hospital because it sustained a lot of damage. Some were sent to Puerto Rico, some people were sent to Puerto Rico after Irma, and then afterwards, people were airlifted off that island, were misplaced. So people lost track of their family members. Then Maria hit, and those people that were sent throughout the United States. And you didn't even know because now they have to do the emergency evacuation. So the fact that their family members were placed into different areas and didn't know as a way to evacuate. So you don't know where your family members end up missing for months, and now people couldn't find their family members. And unfortunately, this woman that spoke about the situation found out that her father passed away. Right. But she didn't find out for weeks afterwards. She didn't even know where he was. Right. So the fact that now they're dealing with having to have their family members evacuated because they, these individuals needed more medical care, but they're not able to keep in contact with their family members. Right. So you can imagine the stress that you're going through when you already can't find the people that you care about during a storm. And then the fact that now they're jumped throughout different states, throughout different jurisdictions, you don't know where they are, and then to find out that they passed away, that's very disheartening. And I don't think that's something that we would or can fathom here on the on the mainland. Even though there are situations like this, these are some things that we need to highlight. The fact that there are individuals who are dealing with these kinds of situations. There needs to be some type of answer to this. The last theme was the community response and efforts. So a lot of the times when they spoke, I asked them, like, how did you know the storm was coming? How did you communicate with each other? And they said they either did it word of mouth, so talking to their community members, their friends. Hey, I heard this thing is happening. One person said that they had a family member who was a emergency manager in Florida and was like, hey, there's a hurricane coming your way. This person now in the Virgin Islands went to spread the news. Hey guys, I think there's a storm coming. We need to prepare. Another way was through radio. A lot of people had NOAA radios. Not everyone did, but the local radio station was how they were able to communicate whether there were tarps left at the fire station, where to find water if there was any, where to get any meals if there were any type of medical care, how to navigate the different spaces. So that's one way in which they kept together. However, they were saying that there was no togetherness when it came to the community and the country. So the fact that it was very individualistic when it came to addressing everyone's issues, where everybody's just like, I need to protect my own home and my home alone because I can't worry about everyone else. And these women were just like, during past events, a lot of the times everyone would come together, we'll deal with the issues together, figure out how we can help one another. But because of how detrimental this was, because of how difficult the space was, how difficult it was to deal with now this change that they're dealing with after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and now dealing with the heat, a lot of people were just focusing on making sure that their family members or themselves were safe. And so overall, I asked them, like, who were your first responders? Did you have any first responders coming? And one woman just blatantly said, we were our own first responders. We were the people that saved ourselves, right? And so this, even though we would like for different communities to be resilient and to figure out ways to help themselves, there's also needs to be some type of government help, or in other areas where we see a lot of FEMA or different organizations come to step up and protect these people or to help them with the recovery process. This is not something that was shared among the speakers or the participants of this study. And so I wanted to highlight this one quote from the Combahee River Collective. And it says, the most general statement of our politics at the present time, and this was in 1977, would be that we're actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppressions are interlocking, right? So the fact that in 1970, this group of Black lesbian feminists came together and they were speaking about their relationships with the environment, with the government, with their social connections, with society in general. This is still an ongoing fight. This is not an old fight, right? So again, acknowledging the historical impacts, the historical injustices, the historical oppressions and discriminations that has impacted individuals to experience these now current disasters, these current environmental hazards, and future climate-related hazards, they still have to figure out a way to navigate these spaces, not only on a micro level, but now but also a macro level. And these are some things that need to be acknowledged when it comes to understanding how do we make more equitable choices, more equitable processes. And so overall, there was a lot of physical, environmental, and psychological stressors that came from the focus groups, or just from the experiences that these Black women shared. A lot of times the women were saying that they had trouble sleeping, that they would have small panic attacks when they would hear rain, but their children, right? So young children. One woman was a director of medicine, and she said that her daughter was 1 at the time. Her daughter can recognize hurricane damage and would say, that's hurricane damage, that's hurricane damage. But when there's a huge downpour of rain, her daughter gets really, really scared and hides in the closet, right? Because she doesn't know if another storm's coming. Another woman said that her parents, elderly parents, have the same type of PTSD symptoms where if there's a lot of rain, they're scared and they're like, come pick me up because I don't know if another hurricane is coming, or I don't know if Maria is going to come again, right? So dealing with those kind of psychological stressors, the physical stressors of them now having to physically remove all of this dirt, destruction, figure out how to build their households again, kind of being forced to move on because they're not getting the proper federal or local government help that they need in order to adjust to these new changes that happen. And then if we're thinking about environmental issues on top of all of this, the fact that there's a lot of noise and air pollution on the Virgin Islands, and a lot of people still have to deal with that. The fact that the waterways are now contaminated from all of the debris, and now trying to figure out how do we succumb or fight flooding that's happening on the island. They highlighted the lack of resources and the fact that and acknowledged that all of this lack of resources that they've historically had, and then on top of that now with the disasters, this all led to a prolonged recovery process. Like I said before, I went in 2019, 2 years before the storm, and it felt like it just occurred. They spoke about being socially politically disenfranchised, their distinct experiences being overshadowed, and then now dealing with compounding disasters. And so overall, one of the main recommendations that I have, there needs to be more inclusive programming and planning. It's not like these individuals do not know what we're speaking about. They have complete and utter and factual and validated knowledge about their experiences, their lived experiences on a daily basis, but also with disasters. And so they may have some knowledge that we may not be used to, or may not even acknowledge or be cognizant of. And so it's very important for us to include these voices and understand how these voices have historically been marginalized, which is why they're still continuing to deal with these same issues. And this cannot continue, especially if we're talking about the threat of climate change, the threat of increasing, disasters and hazards that's going to happen. And so to wrap this up, I'd like to, one, acknowledge the Black women who were gracious enough to share their stories with me and granting me the privilege to amplify their voices, right? So for me, using my privilege as a doctor and the spaces that I'm able to jump into, I was able to share their stories with you all, which I hope resonated with you all. And so for that, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. And I have all of my contact information here. I also have a reading list in which August, I believe, will go about in sharing this with everyone. But I also want to thank you, and I'm open to any questions, comments, or concerns. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jean. And I am going to chat in the reading list, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat. Okay. So the first question is, are knowledge projects only academic to be done at the university level, or can community organizations initiate these studies?
I think a knowledge project is anything that can teach other people. I don't see it as strictly academic. For me, that's one of my dislikes about academia, the fact that a lot of knowledge or different ways of going about learning is very elite, very westernized, very centered around academia. One thing I like about knowledge projects, it can be used in any form, right? Like I said before, rap, hip hop, and blues, those came from singers, right? Who historically have low income backgrounds. These are individuals that were able to use their voice, their stories to amplify these things, right? So grassroots organizations or nonprofits or different organizations that have a direct tie with the community can use anything as a knowledge project, right? Through storytelling, through different memos, blogs, social media, different talks like this. This can form as a knowledge project where you can teach a large group of individuals about situations and use it to your benefit, right? And do it over and over and over again so that we can have these conversations and to acknowledge what's happening on a grander scale. So yeah, I think a knowledge project is as inclusive as I would like and definitely very, very useful. I think you're muted.
2.5 years. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jean. We have one more question, and that is, the asker says, thank you for hosting the series, Dr. Jean. You mentioned young people being a marginalized group as well. Do you have any particular recommendations for how to involve youth voice in climate justice? And do you see the process as being different for involving young people versus adults?
That's a good question. So on the side, I am a mental health facilitator for high school students. And so a lot of the times what we do is we combine social justice and mental health. And speaking to these high school students, it's a program in which they joined. It's the ELSJI in New York. A lot of the times these students, which are like sophomore and junior, they're well aware of what's happening. They're actually very politically active. And so finding an organization that's already connected to high school students and then asking if you can join or like asking for the space to kind of amplify their voices and to let them know the strengths that they do have, I think that's very beneficial. I think that when we acknowledge young people as people, then there isn't a difference, personally to me, when it comes to engaging with adults versus younger people. I think some of the times when people see someone that's under the age of 18, you automatically assume, oh, they're a child, they don't know what they're talking about. But if we're thinking about little Miss Flint, who was like 8 years old, telling everyone about the Flint water crisis, what she was saying was extremely valid, right? And she was very, very young. And she was able to maneuver into a space where she was able to amplify her voices to the point where now she's in high school and she's still doing all these grassroots work, right? So there are children, young people, young folks that are out here that are dedicated. It's just, are we giving them the space to be involved, right? Are we giving them the opportunity to be involved? And are we telling them that their voices and involvement are valid? And a lot of the times I don't think that they feel that way. So they may respond. I've heard like high school students say, I feel so helpless when it comes to this. And it's just like, yes, I understand, these things are weighing very heavy on you. These, different social justice issues are weighing heavy on you. And I think you don't feel like you have anything to do because you don't feel like people will listen to you. But we hear you, right? Put it in a way that we can understand it. Write it down. So I tell the students, go ahead and do a small article if you have to. Have different community meetings, right? Invite different people that you look up to come into your space so they could just listen, right? So I think just taking the time for people to, zip their mouth, listen to these people because they have valid things to say. I think that that's the more equitable approach in doing this and acknowledging both sides, both younger people and older folks as people overall. And then also acknowledging how, when it comes to younger people, because of their age, they may be marginalized, they need more special attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jean.
Thank you.
Okay, friends. Well, if there are no more questions for Dr. Jean, I'd like to wrap up to our first C4 JEDI speaker series, inviting all of you to not only sign up for next month's free speaker series, share it with your colleagues, with your friends. And with that being said, I'm going to share my screen as well to close us out. I want to invite all of you, if you are curious about how you can incorporate intersectionality into your organization's practices and culture. Oops, interesting. Where did that go? Sorry, friends, let me stop sharing my screen just for a moment. Okay, let's try that again. Oh, sad face. Well, I'm not sure why that's not working. Anyways, I will be sure to send out information about how you can get involved with working with C4, or as well as continuing any work you would like, if you'd like to invite Dr. Jean to speak at your organization, as well as get information about our JEDI cohort series. We will be working with up to 10 different organizations starting again in January 2023. So if your organization would like to find out how you can ensure your practices are inclusive and just, please do sign up for more information about that. And with that, friends, I hope you have an amazing week. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.